I got to know Herb Brooks very, very well. And I traveled with the team before they won. And I was very fortunate. The day I met Herb Brooks, he said to me, you know, he says, I've really followed your stuff. And I guess I felt very good about that. And I don't know whether he was BSing me, because Herb was a great bullshitter. But I suppose he was, because I was one of the few writers for national publications who was the regular hockey writer. And so he had a lot of respect for me, I think. He had a lot of respect for the New York Times. But, you know, it was very hard to tell with Herb where the truth lay. He used to love to call himself, he was just a guy from the sidewalks, you know. Well, you know what, he was in St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, I don't know much about St. Paul, Minnesota, but I don't think it's like the sidewalks of New York. He used to call himself a street guy. I never heard of anyone west of Brooklyn, where I lived, ever calling themselves a street guy. But Herb did sort of live in that moment when he was the last guy cut from the 1960 Olympic champions. And perhaps there was a bitter moment, but not when I knew Herb. And maybe if I knew him back then, he would have talked about it. But, you know, whenever Herb would narrow his eyes and say something, you know, it made you wonder, what is this guy really thinking? I liked the fact that his eyes would narrow when he would talk about the Soviets. He would tell me he was trying to put together an American style of hockey that would reflect who America is and what America was all about. And he was putting together an American collective, which was different from the hockey collective, because he wanted to combine America's capitalism, which would promote individualism, as opposed to some hockey people that believed that hockey was just a team game and that you had to restrain your individualistic techniques. I believe that Herb combined hockey's, or American hockey's, two greatest assets. And then he had another shtick that he did, and that was to play the New England players against the Minnesota players. Because hockey was essentially in America was in two areas. It was the Northeast, which was the Boston-based area, and the Midwest, which was based around Minnesota. And what he did was he had those guys from Minnesota fighting against the guys from New England. And it was sort of a competing wills and competing areas. I got to know Craig a little bit. I got to know Ken Morrow, but really in writing about the Olympics, Brooks was such an outsized character that he was the guy that I really gravitated toward. And there was another thing. Herb didn't want me, even me, who he had buttered up, didn't want me really hanging around the locker room with these guys too much. I sort of kept my distance from them, but was fascinated with what he was doing. So Herb, with his Brooksisms, you know, he would tell these guys, you know, you got to face the tiger and spit in the eye and all this other stuff. There was one thing about the players that I did get to talk to that surprised me, like a Ruzioni. They would look at me and they would sort of shrug their shoulders when I'd mention Brooks, as if, what can you do with this guy? Because he was driving them crazy. But they knew it too. And in a way, the smart guys like a Ruzioni, knew exactly what he was trying to do. Herb made two great speeches in that series. On Friday night, he said to them, you were born to be here. In other words, this was your moment. You were born to be here. Well, the game is over. They beat the Russians. We have the press conference in the auditorium of the high school across the street. And the kids, these U.S. kids are falling all over, laughing and smiling. And it was like they were drunk. In fact, some of them had drinks in their hand. I think they were drunk. And I went over to him and I grabbed him on the side, and he allowed me to go in to see him privately. And I said, Herb, I said, did you really say to them that you were born to be here? And he goes into his vest pocket and he pulls out a piece of paper and shows it to me so he shouldn't forget it, and says, you were born to be here. 36 hours later, they beat the Finns. What he actually said to them, if you don't win this game, you'll regret it the rest of your fucking lives. That's how you motivate a team.